Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Great America Show. It's great to have you with us. It seems that each day that goes by, the U.S. faces a threat from a different angle of the world. The threat of nuclear war from Russia or Iran. The threat of illegal immigrants coming across the southern border. Or perhaps the threat of the deadly fentanyl that comes across each day. But there's one threat that stayed constant for a very long time, and that is China. I had mentioned fentanyl. They are the leading producer of it and send it into this country freely each day, and that is thanks to the Biden administration. Fentanyl is responsible for taking the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans each year. They also sent us the China virus, which claimed the lives of over 1 million Americans and over 7 million globally. And since the Biden administration has taken over, there has been little to nothing done to hold China accountable for anything they've done to us. To take up all the current and future threats we face, I want to bring in our guest today. He's the author of the all-new book called Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. It comes out on October 1st, and it's available for pre-order now. He's Gordon Chang. Gordon, it's great to have you with us. I want to start with first, China announcing this week they're going to start joint naval drills with Russia. What does this mean for America? What does it mean for the world?
This shows once again, John, that China and Russia are coordinating their militaries. This particular naval exercise will be near Japan, and that indicates this is a threat to not only the Japanese homeland, but to South Korea as well. If there's going to be a war, you could be Taiwan, could be the Philippines, but clearly I think the Chinese will pressure both South Korea and Japan. So this will be a region-wide war. And by the way, we got wars in Ukraine, the Middle East, and in North Africa with those insurgencies that look like wars. That means this is probably World War III if something happens in East Asia.
You had mentioned Africa. Xi Jinping was over in Africa this week for the 2024 month of China-Africa cooperation, where he's trying to get started back up the Belt and Road Initiative, offering up loans with free forgiveness. I mean, what is this part of his plan to dominate all global aspects of the world? I mean, you see him down in Honduras, down in Nicaragua, building power plants and all sorts of things. Coming up just short of Mexico, which I'm sure he'll make his way into eventually. What's his plan?
Yeah, his plan is to rule the world. And they've been very clear about it because he's been pushing the notion that China is the world's only legitimate state. And since 2017, Chinese officials have been talking about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory.
Right.
Now, this meeting with the African leaders is important for Xi Jinping because not only is this a question of trying to govern the entire planet and to colonize Africa, but it's also Xi Jinping desperately needs the African economies. His economy is failing. He has turned his back on the only sustainable plan for China, which is to increase consumption, which means his only play is to export more. We're seeing the United States, EU start to restrict their markets. Even some countries in the global south are starting to restrict their markets to Chinese goods. So Xi Jinping needs to export a lot to Africa to keep his country going.
You had mentioned the recession in China, and who really knows how bad it is, because nothing we get out of China, it's sort of like the Biden administration, nothing we get out of China is really true. So who knows how bad the numbers are? What do you predict they really are as for GDP, as for exports, over the last year versus 2023?
Yeah, China claimed 4.7% growth for the second quarter of this year. That is a mythical figure because China was probably hovering around zero. And since the end of the second quarter, we've seen marked deterioration in the Chinese economy. Especially the country is now in deflation. That's clear in the factory sector. If it weren't for the worsening food shortages in China, which has raised prices of food, the consumer price index would also, I think, be negative. Right now, it is positive, as we saw for August. But once you strip out food and some other things and get to core inflation, I think that they probably are negative. And you can't have robust growth if you're in a deflationary cycle downward. So this is serious for Xi Jinping. And as I mentioned, his prescriptions to get this done are just not realistic. So I don't see that they'll be able to save their economy.
Now, who's to thank for that? In America, we have Joe Biden to thank for what's happened to this economy, whether it's killing every single new lease for oil to drill, or exporting everything they could possibly export overseas and not hire and buy American. Who's to blame for this demise of China?
Well, Xi Jinping has been General Secretary of the Communist Party since November 2012, so he certainly deserves a lot of the blame. If you step back, clearly China right now is having its 2008 downturn. In 2008, they decided not to have a downturn along with the rest of the world, so they overstimulated their economy. They built too many high-speed rail lines, too many bridges. They built too much of everything. And now they're having trouble sort of digesting the debt. But Xi Jinping has made it worse because he believes in a state-dominated economy. Right. So he's not only pushing out the foreign businesses, he's also pushing out domestic Chinese private entrepreneurs. These are the most productive parts of the Chinese economy. These are the parts of the economy that led the revival in the reform era, which is basically 4 decades of growth. So Xi Jinping deserves a lot of blame for this. And in fact, he is being blamed for this.
So I actually read something this morning that they're offering for companies to come in and start businesses in China, private companies in China. I don't think a lot of people realize that there's no such thing as private in China. Everything is owned by China. Everything's controlled by China up until the very, words you say or the baby that comes out of your womb. Who would be dumb enough to go into China and start new business, seeing after what we saw happen during COVID, whether it be 90% of our medical supplies and medicine, deadly medicines that we need in this country from India and China? Who would be so dumb to go over there and give them, and I say give them because they're not stealing our intellectual property, we give it to them. Who would be dumb enough to go over there and start anything?
Basically, that's a great question because as Xi Jinping has been pushing foreign companies out and they've been leaving, there are sort of 2 categories of companies that want in. One of them are the German car makers, and that's a long story. And the other is American pharmaceutical companies are starting to think about putting more production into China. But, everybody else is leaving. And I think eventually the American drug companies are going to decide that this is not a good idea. But, they're talking about it now.
The interesting thing, I love Elon Musk. I think he's the smartest man alive. And Lou was always hung up on him. And I always used to tell him, I'm like, why don't you love this guy? He's the modern day Einstein. And he loved him, but he had one problem with him and his dependency on China. Without China, Elon Musk can't make a car battery. And they've kind of got him in a position. And if these German car makers don't see that Elon can't get out of China because he's so tied up with them. I want to ask you, the Trump tariffs that he put on, does that have anything to do with what's going on with their economy right now that the Biden administration has left on?
Yeah. President Trump said that he would increase the China tariffs to at least 60% and maybe even 100%.
Yeah.
And there's a couple things going on here. First of all, the 2018 tariffs that President Trump put in place, those were those were remedies for the theft of U.S. intellectual property. Right. They were imposed under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Really, though, going forward, any new tariffs are going to be because of China's predatory trade practices. What they are doing is they're using massive subsidies to domestic Chinese companies to basically produce more than China could ever consume. And that's the situation right now, but Xi Jinping is doubling down on that, which means that this is a violation not only of their World Trade Organization obligations, but this is also like the biggest beggar thy neighbor program in history. And basically, Xi Jinping doesn't want any other country to manufacture anything. And so we need to protect our markets. And so President Trump is right about this. These tariffs need to go up and they need to be substantial. They need to be substantial increases.
We're going to talk about that on the other side of this break. You had mentioned the possibility of Trump putting more tariffs on them. I think a big problem that sits in Trump's heart, and I say his heart because I think it's near and dear to him, is COVID, and that he never did anything to get back at China for COVID. So I think when Trump comes back in, he's going to be looking for retribution, and I think tariffs is going to be a big key. We're talking with Gordon Chang. We'll be right back. Stay with us. We're back. We're talking with Gordon Chang. And Gordon, right before we went to break there, we were talking about China and war and tariffs and everything that comes with it. just to go past history a little bit, in World War I in America, we were going through a recession. The war it turned a 44-month economic boost. World War II from 1937 to 39, we were in a recession. Vietnam, we were experiencing extreme inflation. China obviously is in a very bad place right now, and there's no doubt that war might help them out a little bit. There's a very short timeline with tsunami season coming and who they will attack, presumably Taiwan. Could be us, could be somebody else. If they are to attack, with the notion that President Trump comes back in November, give me a timeline, if you will, of when they will and how they'll go about doing so.
Yeah, a really important question. In general, we got to be prepared for anything at any place at any time. But if we're looking at what is most probable, I don't think the Chinese will start hostilities with an invasion of the main island of Taiwan. A lot of reasons for that. But what we have been seeing in the Philippines, in the South China Sea, especially since the middle of June, indicates that's the most likely place. One of the reasons why China won't attack Taiwan, in my belief, is that it's too hard, too many casualties. I think they're looking for a quick political win, and they believe that the Philippines is the easiest place for that. Xi Jinping right now, he can't save the Chinese economy unless he does something like start a war. I don't think that I think he eventually will see that he's going to be lost. And he wants a war, not because the Chinese people want it. Chinese people right now do not want war, and they especially don't want a war with Taiwan.
Right.
But I think that Xi Jinping would start a war because he'd want to prevent other senior Communist Party leaders from deposing him.
Right.
So this is a Communist Party play, in my view. And the Philippines is the most likely place for that because of what we've been seeing recently.
Well, give me a timeline. I mean, China has an issue and the islands down there that we don't have over here and they don't have over in the Middle East, and that's monsoon season. So it gives them a very short window on when they could attack. First, if you will, give me a timeline of when they could. You don't have to be very specific, but, will it be in the next 2-3 months?
Yeah, I tend not to think in the next 2-3 months, but remember, what they're doing in the Philippines every week can start a war. It is that belligerent. So one of those incidents can spiral out of control. So this could be very, very soon. But in terms of China actually thinking about provoking a war, if you have to have a time frame, I'd say in the next year. And the reason is, I don't think it's so much time to events in the U.S. I think it's time to events inside China, inside the top of the Communist Party, which we can't see. And I think that what it'll be timed eventually to will be the failure of what we were talking about before, which is the Chinese economy. They can still hang on a little bit longer, but I think that they're going to come to a conclusion pretty soon that they cannot save the economy. And that's when I think that they make the go, no go decision. So one other thing.
You're not sold. So you're not sold on the prospect of Trump having anything to do with it?
He'll have something to do with it. But I think that Xi Jinping is reacting primarily to domestic incentives inside the Communist Party. Because that's the way that they normally have reacted in the past. If you go back through Communist Party history, go back to 1949, it's primarily they're reacting to what's going on inside of Beijing. One other thing, we can't say right now that Xi Jinping has made the decision to go to war, but we can say one thing 100%, and that is he's made the decision to risk war because he has been risking war in the South China Sea. Right. And so he is prepared to go to war at this time or at any time.
You had mentioned it's interesting because he's been beating the Taiwan drumbeat for a very long time, giving us dates 2025, 2030, and so on. When did the pivot come from going into Taiwan to now looking at the Philippines?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can tell you that, we've seen very hostile air and naval maneuvers against Taiwan, but they've never really gone beyond trying to intimidate the Taiwanese. And in February of this year, China actually had in its mind a cause for war. because that was when two Chinese fishermen drowned after being pursued by the Taiwan Coast Guard. Now, those Chinese fishermen should not have been in Taiwan's waters, but in China's mind, that was a reason to go to war. And they didn't do it. They huffed and they puffed. And after that, it, I think, became clear that they were going after the Philippines rather than Taiwan. But, you know, anything can happen. And people in Taiwan, they're thinking it might be a blockade, might be a quarantine,
Right.
and that could come within recent months. But that's very different than launching an invasion against the main island of Taiwan.
So I want to tie something else into this now, and that's North Korea. Xi Jinping sending a letter to Pyongyang and Kim Jong Un, telling him he wants to strengthen ties with him, you know, after not talking with him for 8 months. How does now North Korea tie into this, and what does it mean for South Korea?
Yeah, most people believe that North Korea has moved far away from China and very close to Russia. Kim Jong Un went to a Russian cosmodrome near Vladivostok last September. Vladimir Putin went to Pyongyang in June. That's when they signed up their mutual defense treaty and their comprehensive strategic partnership pact. I have a slightly different take on this, and that is that I believe that China was more or less the mastermind between closer Russia-North Korea ties. And the reason is both Russia and North Korea absolutely depend on China, and neither are in a position to betray China. So I think that we're seeing a little bit of kabuki. I think that Xi Jinping likes all of this because what's happening is that North Korea is keeping Russia in the Ukraine war, and Xi Jinping is not taking the heat for doing that. So I think that China gets a lot of benefits from this. I'm not prepared to say, oh, you know, the relationship between China and North Korea is as strong as it's ever been in history. But nonetheless, I think the relations are really strong. And we should assume that we have here North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China are forming a durable partnership that is confronting us and waging war on the international system.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that any relationship with China is genuine. I think at any point, if something were to happen and there had been a vulnerability, Russia would be all over it. What does Russia do if China is to attack, we'll say, Taiwan or the Philippines? Do they sit back? Do they get involved? Are they proxies in it? And does Iran tie into this in any way?
Yeah, that really is a critical question because, you know, we started by talking about the China-Russia naval drills near Japan. I think that we have to assume that if China starts a war in East Asia, that Russia will come in on China's side.
Really?
I'm not saying that 100%, but I have to say that when we plan for war, that's what we have to just assume will happen. Because we see that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, they have been coordinating all their policies, including their naval and air maneuvers. So this is a military relationship as much as anything else. And Xi Jinping has been fully behind Russia, keeping it in the war in Ukraine. So I think that Vladimir Putin, if Xi Jinping asks him to or demands that he do that, I don't think Vladimir Putin's in a position to say no.
It's very interesting because, you know, if that were to happen, Vladimir Putin would have a war on the left of him and a war on the right of him. And when he invaded Ukraine, we all expected it, I think, to just be days, maybe a week, maybe a month. But as long as it's gone on, I think we all overestimated, and correct me if I'm wrong, Russia's power on the military level. You know, we anticipated, I think they had a lot more soldiers than they really had. A lot more military arsenal than they really had. How does Russia, they can't even win a war against Ukraine. I mean, they're winning it, you know, on its face right now, but they can't finish the deal of what they want to accomplish. How does Russia now get into a war over in the Philippines or Taiwan? How do they even afford it?
Well, they've got a Pacific Fleet. And, you know, it's more, I think, that because Xi Jinping has been providing substantial assistance to Russia's war effort in Ukraine, Putin just can't say no. You know, Putin might not want to go to war in East Asia, but I don't think he really has a choice. So right now, you know, you're absolutely right. we all overestimated Russia's ability. I thought that Russia would take Kyiv in a week,
Yeah.
2 weeks at the most, and we know that didn't happen. Right now Russia is bogged down. It's making some gains in the Donbass, but it's losing in the Kursk area. And clearly Russia's taking a beating. So yeah, they're having a real hard time staying in this war. So you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. I don't want to equate it to like if U.S. would invade Mexico, but I the war just doesn't make sense to me. Russia and Ukraine and how it's gone on for so long. I mean, Ukraine's getting a crap ton of money from America and other nations. Could be the reason the war's still going on. I'm not entirely sure. It's above my pay grade. I want to take a quick break here. When we return, I want to talk about the declining birth rates in China and now China putting a pause on anyone adopting Chinese children. I also want to take up what happens if Kamala Harris wins, what that means for America and China relations. We're talking with Gordon Chang. Stay with us. We're back. We're talking with Gordon Chang. Gordon, before we went to break, I said we were talking about China birth rates in decline. Apparently, China's turning their kindergartens into nursing homes now as they, have a very big birth rate collapse. But it's not just China; it's America too. Nobody's talking about that. You have abortion centers on every corner. The Democrats wanting to abort every child that's inside the womb of a woman. What does this mean for China now that they've stopped allowing foreigners to adopt Chinese children?
What it means for China is that the country is in long-term, almost irreversible decline.
Yeah.
China now has a population of about 1.4 billion. By the turn of the century, China could be 488, 490 million people, maybe a little bit more.
Wow.
Most estimates put China at a higher figure, but we're seeing a collapse in the total fertility rate. We're seeing all sorts of signs which indicate that China will lose somewhere on the order of 2/3 of its population between now and the time the clock strikes 2100. This will be the steepest decline in history in the absence of war or disease. And we have little idea how it's going to affect Chinese society because no country has gone through this unless it's been ravaged by a war or disease. Right now, but it means that China is going to be a small, mid-sized country by the turn of the century. It's not going to be the behemoth that everybody envisions now, and that has so many geopolitical and other consequences.
Yeah, they're calling it a quote severely aging society by 2035, even before the turn of the century at 2021. I mean, how does China get to this? I mean, this is a nation, as we just said before, that they do everything to tell you, even up and to tell you how to hold your fork and knife. How do you get to a situation now where you have a country that depends on its military and its citizens to be enrolled in its military and ready to fight at any moment? How do you get into a situation like this now where, like you said, at the turn of the century, they're in big trouble? They're even saying now by 2035, in just 11 years, they're even bigger trouble. How does it get to that point? At one point, China was telling you how many kids you were allowed to have, how many boys you're allowed to have, and girls. Now we're at a situation where they don't even want to get rid of their own people.
Yeah, it got into this in two different ways, John. One of them was the one-child policy that was put into effect at the end of the 1970s. Before that, China had a total fertility rate, which is the average number of children per female who's reached childbearing age. They had a total fertility rate in somewhere like 5.9 or something, very high. And then essentially what they said was, look, people can only have one child. Mm-hmm. So that certainly had a big effect. And there was decades of indoctrination. But they ended the one China policy in the end of 2015. And the Chinese people did not respond by an increase in fertility rates. And the reason is that there's been pessimism in Chinese society. Right now, there's a gloom where people are just opting out, which is one of the reasons why we have so many Chinese people trying to get into other countries, including ours, by the way. So really what this shows is, Chinese people just do not want to reproduce. This was highlighted last year when a viral video of a Chinese male, basically early 30s, looking into the camera and saying, I love my son so much, I will not allow him to be born into this society.
Wow.
That's the mentality of the Chinese people right now.
I mean, you look at everything that goes on in China, and I mean, you could say the same thing for America. Who the hell wants to have kids today? You're putting them into a society where when they're born, you don't know if they're male or female. In China, you have a child born, and if they're a Muslim, they could end up in a concentration camp. I just don't understand, how we got to this point. And it's not only China's fault, it's America's fault too for propping them up for so long. I want to turn to Tim Waltz, who spent years promoting a research facility that collaborated with the Chinese military. Talk to me about this, Gordon. What does it mean for a Waltz-Harris administration and China? Because if you're reading the New York Times, they say that Tim Waltz's long-term relationship with China defies easy stereotypes. What does that even mean?
Well, I believe that Tim Waltz is a true believer. And we've seen this, in the 1990s, the following decade, when he was running high school students to China to be exposed to Communist Party propaganda. He could not have conducted those operations without the approval of the Communist Party's United Front Work Department, which is the part of the party that subverts foreign governments. Now, Tim Waltz could make an argument saying, I was just young and naive and stupid. But the problem is, we've seen this with Daily Caller reporting of August 27th, that Tim Waltz, as governor of Minnesota, has maintained continuous contacts with United Front Work Department front organizations in Minnesota. So clearly, this is something that he believes in. And also, we've heard Tim Waltz recently say that socialism is just like being a good neighbor. So these are long-held beliefs. And if their ticket wins in November, that means we may have a communist sympathizer one heartbeat away from the Oval Office.
What's amusing to me, and it's not really amusing, but it's just the hypocrisy of it all, is Tim Waltz last week was at an event for inclusivity, and it was nonetheless an LGBTQXYZ event where he was promoting Get Out, and that these people should be able to do this freely and XYZ. But what you didn't hear about is the Uyghur camps. And while he worked with China for years, I mean, it's something now that's come to light like it hasn't ever in the past. And it's thanks to people like you. But a lot of people still don't know what Uyghur camps are. Tell the audience, if you will, Gordon, for those who don't know, what China does to these people that they're putting in concentration camps.
China, especially since 2017, has been committing crimes against humanity against the Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic minorities. And this has been such a fierce campaign that it actually constitutes genocide, as it's defined in the Genocide Convention. They've detained millions. We don't know exactly how many, but could be somewhere between 2 and 3 million Uyghurs and Kazakhs and others in concentration camp facilities. They have made sure that the Uyghurs can't reproduce. They've been imprisoning children as official policy. There's official policy of rape of Uyghur women. There's been torture, brutality, murder. We know that because they built a crematorium between two of these detention facilities. So this is an attempt to eliminate Uyghur culture and identity. They're doing the same thing more or less with Tibetans, and they're now starting in earnest against the Mongolians. So this is a program countrywide to eliminate minority consciousness.
Yeah, and this is obviously something that's pushed by, and it's only these bad people you see in America who are doing business with China, and I mean personal business, the Biden crime family, the Clintons, the Tim Waltz family. I want to wrap up with Donald Trump and his return to the White House. We talked about a little bit earlier. He's vowing up to 100% tariff on countries ditching the U.S. dollar. He's saying, quote, you don't leave the dollar. You leave the dollar and you're not doing business with the United States because we're going to put 100% tariff on your goods. He's tired of China's currency manipulation, which we've fallen prey to over the last few years. If we do see 100% tariff placed on goods from China and countries that are taking advantage of America, what does that mean for America and what does it mean for China?
Well, for China, it probably means the end of their economy because Xi Jinping has put his fate into the hands of those countries that buy Chinese goods, and we're the biggest market for that. And it means that we have a chance of ending the communist threat without the use of force. This is, I think, really good policy. Now, some people may say it's dangerous, and I'll say, yeah, of course it's dangerous.
Right.
But because of 5 decades of truly misguided and horrible American policy towards China, or at least one can say 3 decades of very, very bad policy toward China, every option we have is dangerous right now. And so I think President Trump has the right idea. It is the only way that we're going to get out of this without war, in my view.
Yeah, I think November 5th is America's, saving grace day, or, its day of detriment. And hopefully Americans go to the polls that day and, they vote their conscience, because I don't think we could live another 4 years of what we've seen, because it's only going to get worse from here. And who knows how much worse it will really get. Gordon Chang, he's got an old new book out. It's out October 1st, but it's available for pre-order now. Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. Gordon, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, everybody, for being with us, and thanks to Gordon Chang. Be sure to pre-order his book now, Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. It's out October 1st, but available for pre-order now. Be sure to join us back here tomorrow for the Great America Show as our quest for truth, justice, and the American way continues. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at John Fawcett NY and on Truth Social at John Fawcett. Shoot me a tweet. Let me know what you want to hear more of on this show. You can also email us at info@loudobbs.com. We want to hear from you. We'll see you back here tomorrow. May God bless you. May God bless America. And may God bless the great Lou Dobbs.